The restaurant was one of the finest in the city, known for its elegant atmosphere, exquisite cuisine, and an exclusive guest list that included politicians, celebrities, and the who's who of the business world. Located in the heart of the bustling city, it was a place where even the slightest disruption could feel like an earthquake. It was a Tuesday evening, and the place was packed with well-dressed patrons savoring their meals. The air was filled with the soft clinking of glasses, quiet laughter, and the soothing hum of classical music that played in the background. The door swung open with a soft chime, and in walked a figure that no one could ignore. Donald Trump, wearing his signature red MAGA hat, jeans, and a dark blazer, entered the restaurant. The room instantly fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks and knives paused mid-air. The room's energy shifted as eyes turned toward the entrance. Trump was used to the attention. After all, he was a man who thrived on it, but the tension in the air was palpable, almost suffocating. The MAGA hat, once a symbol of his political movement, now seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 judgments. The whispers began almost immediately, spreading like wildfire through the guests. Some tried to glance casually in his direction, others whispered behind their menus, speculating on why the former president had chosen this particular restaurant tonight. No one dared to speak too loudly. At the front of the restaurant, the hostess, a young woman in a sleek black uniform, was the first to make eye contact. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second as she looked at Trump and then down at the red cap perched atop his head. She hesitated, unsure of how to handle the situation. It wasn't every day that a former president walked into your restaurant, especially one known for wearing a controversial symbol like the MAGA hat. After a brief pause, she composed herself and stepped forward with professional politeness. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remove your hat," she said softly, but firmly. Trump raised an eyebrow, his surprise evident. "I beg your pardon?" The hostess, clearly nervous but standing her ground, repeated her request. "We have a policy here, sir. No political symbols allowed inside the restaurant. I'm going to have to ask you to remove your hat or leave." Trump's face hardened for a moment, his signature confidence turning to mild irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged in this manner, especially not in a place like this. "I'm just here to eat, not to make any political statements," he replied calmly. "It's just a hat." But the hostess wasn't backing down. "I understand, sir, but it's our policy. We've had incidents before, and we need to keep the atmosphere neutral for our guests." The words hung in the air like a weight. The other patrons, once whispering amongst themselves, now watched with keen interest. It wasn't every day that you saw someone of Trump's stature involved in a standoff at a restaurant. Some patrons looked uncomfortable, fidgeting in their seats, while others looked on with quiet curiosity, eager to see how this would unfold. Trump's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not here to start trouble," he said, his tone beginning to shift from confusion to mild frustration. "I'm just a regular customer here. What's the issue with my hat?" The hostess, not wanting to escalate the situation further but also not willing to back down, glanced at her manager who was standing nearby. The manager, a tall man with a crisp suit, came over quickly, his face a mixture of professionalism and uncertainty. "Sir, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to either remove the hat or leave the restaurant," the manager said, his voice calm but firm. Trump paused, looking at the two staff members before glancing around the room. All eyes were on him. The tension was thick now, almost tangible. His mind raced. He had been in far more intense situations before, but this one felt different. The restaurant was filled with powerful people, influencers who would take note of what happened next. How would it look if he simply walked out? Or worse, what if he made a scene? On the other hand, he wasn't the type to let anyone tell him what to do, especially not over something as trivial as a hat. The manager continued to look at him, his expression unreadable. The room was still silent, the atmosphere now charged with an electricity that seemed to pulse through the air. Trump stood there for a moment, weighing his options. Would he let this restaurant dictate his actions, or would he stand his ground? The hostess, sensing the tension building, looked at the manager with a silent plea for backup. "Sir, please," she said, her voice softer now but still firm. "We really can't let you stay with the hat on." Trump took a deep breath, his face still unreadable. He was frustrated, but he wasn't going to let them see that. Instead, he smiled slightly, as if amused by the absurdity of the situation. "I guess we'll have to take this up with someone higher up," he said, his voice laced with calm defiance. The manager hesitated, unsure how to proceed. And in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move in this unexpected standoff. The silence in the room deepened, thickening the air around them like a storm waiting to break. Trump stood at the center of the restaurant, one hand still half raised in defiance. He wasn't a man to back down, especially not in a situation like this. He had faced far harsher scrutiny over the years, on national stages, in courtrooms, and across social media. But this was different. This wasn't about policy or politics. It was about an unspoken judgment, a personal affront that went deeper than the simple request to remove his hat. The more he stood there, the more it stung. "I've been to many restaurants in my life," Trump said, his voice surprisingly calm despite the growing tension. "This is the first time I've ever been asked to remove my hat. What's going on here?" The hostess, her hands trembling slightly, tried to remain composed, but her nerves were beginning to show. She had never expected this kind of confrontation. Sure, she had heard rumors of celebrities or high-profile figures causing a stir, but this was something else entirely. She had seen the way the other guests were watching, some of them whispering, some shaking their heads, others staring with curiosity. The weight of their eyes felt heavy. "We just need to follow the policy," she repeated, her voice lacking the authority it once had. "It's a policy all our guests agree to when they enter." Trump's lips thinned into a line, his gaze never leaving her. He wasn't angry, at least not yet. But the sting of being judged for something as simple as his appearance was starting to cut deeper. "This isn't about the hat, is it? This is about what I represent, isn't it?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. His tone wasn't demanding answers anymore. It was more of an observation, a bitter realization. Before the hostess could respond, the manager, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. He was a tall, clean-cut man, dressed in a black suit that looked perfectly tailored to his frame. His polished demeanor wasn't enough to mask the tension in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he approached Trump. He was trying to handle the situation delicately, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his approach. "Sir, I'm the manager here," the man said, his voice smooth but firm. "I understand this is frustrating, but we have a policy and it's non-negotiable. No political symbols inside the restaurant. It's for the comfort of all our guests." Trump's gaze shifted to the manager, his expression unreadable for a moment. "I'm a paying customer," he said, the words deliberate, cutting through the air with purpose. "I came here to eat, not to discuss politics. I'm not here to make a statement. I'm here to enjoy a meal." The manager hesitated, but only for a second. He had to maintain control of the situation. His job, his reputation, and the reputation of the restaurant were all on the line. "I understand, Mr. Trump, but the policy is in place for a reason. It's not personal." His words, though intended to be calming, only seemed to stoke the flames of frustration that were building in Trump's chest. "It feels personal," Trump replied, his tone shifting slightly. It was no longer a statement of fact, but a quiet accusation, laced with the weariness of being judged based on something as superficial as a hat. "You're telling me what I can wear in your restaurant. You're telling me what symbols I can display. How is that not personal?" The manager's face tightened, and he looked toward the hostess, as if seeking confirmation, but she could only nod, her own discomfort evident. The room was growing more restless. The guests at the tables nearby began to murmur louder, the whispers now more like a buzz in the air. Some patrons were amused, others shocked, and still others seemed downright uncomfortable. "Mr. Trump," the manager said, his voice still calm but strained. "I'm just trying to do my job. I'm not trying to escalate things, but I must ask you to remove the hat or leave. This is the rule." The tension in the room escalated. Guests were now leaning in, their curiosity piqued. Some exchanged glances, others simply stared, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. The air had shifted, and it seemed as if the whole restaurant was holding its breath. Trump glanced around the room, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the crowd. He had been in much tougher situations, moments where the stakes were far higher. But this felt different. It was not the challenge of politics or the media. This was personal. It was about perception. It was about the judgment of the crowd. He could feel the weight of their stares, their whispered thoughts, and it angered him. "I've been a part of this city for years," Trump said, his voice growing louder, more forceful. "I've been to every kind of restaurant in this town, from the fanciest spots to the hole-in-the-wall joints, and I've never been told I can't wear my hat. Why is that? Because of who I am." The manager stiffened, the question hitting a nerve. The truth was that this was not about the hat. It was about what it represented. It was about the politics of the moment, the divide that had been deepened by the years of controversy surrounding Trump's presidency. And now, in this upscale restaurant, the staff found themselves caught in the crossfire of that divide. As the conversation continued, the staff, who had originally remained behind the scenes, started to gather. A few more employees came out from the back, including the head waiter, a man who had worked in fine dining for over a decade. He surveyed the situation, assessing whether the manager could handle the tension, but his presence only added to the atmosphere. One by one, the other diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure how to react. The whispers grew louder, and Trump could hear snippets of conversation from the tables around him. A couple at a nearby table whispered, "Is he really going to make a scene?" Another diner murmured, "He's not even that bad, is he? It's just a hat." Someone else muttered, "If it was anyone else, they'd be kicked out by now." The tension was at its peak, and even the staff members who had been trained to deal with difficult customers seemed unsure how to proceed. This was no longer just about a hat. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. The room had shifted, and everyone was waiting for the next move, unsure of what would happen next. The heated exchange between Trump and the manager was reaching a fever pitch, the air thick with frustration and tension. Every word from Trump carried a hint of disbelief, as if he couldn't fully grasp why he was being treated this way in a place he had never been denied entry. Meanwhile, the manager, visibly uncomfortable but steadfast, continued to defend the restaurant's policy. It was an ordinary dispute at first, nothing more than a disagreement over a simple rule. But as the minutes ticked by, something unusual began to happen. From the far corner of the restaurant, a well-dressed man, appearing calm and composed, observed the situation with a keen eye. He sat at a large table in the back, sipping his drink while the scene at the front unfolded. There was no mistaking the sense of intrigue that clouded his gaze, a mixture of curiosity and perhaps something deeper. The man's presence had gone largely unnoticed, as the chaos in the center of the room had consumed everyone's attention. But now, something had caught his eye, something he felt needed his immediate intervention. Slowly, he stood up, adjusting his suit jacket as he moved across the room. The clinking of glass and the murmur of guests ceased for a moment, their attention shifting to the man as he made his way toward the confrontation. His polished shoes clicked softly against the floor, and with each step, the room seemed to hold its breath. People whispered, recognizing the figure as someone of importance, though no one could quite place his identity. The manager, still in the middle of trying to reason with Trump, glanced over his shoulder. His face faltered slightly as he saw the man approach. clearly unsure of what was about to happen. "I think we need to talk," the man said, his voice firm but calm. He addressed the manager, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. The room fell into an eerie silence as the staff and guests watched in anticipation. The manager turned, his brows furrowing in confusion, and then glanced at Trump, unsure of what to do next. The man didn't wait for the manager's response. He stepped forward, extending his hand toward Trump. "Mr. Trump," he said, his tone now carrying a hint of familiarity, "I'm Name, the owner of this establishment. It's an honor to finally meet you." Trump, still standing tall, looked at the hand for a moment before reaching out to shake it. The surprise was evident on his face, though he remained composed. "I didn't expect a personal introduction," Trump said, his tone now tinged with a sense of curiosity. "Is there something I'm missing here?" "Perhaps," the owner replied, smiling as he gestured for Trump to follow him to a quieter spot in the restaurant, away from the tense crowd. As they moved, the staff remained frozen, unsure of what to do next. They hadn't expected this sudden shift, and the uncomfortable silence only grew. The owner's appearance had thrown everything into disarray, like a twist in a plot no one saw coming. Once they reached a more private area, the owner's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more candid. "You may be wondering why I've stepped in, Mr. Trump. To be honest, I've been watching this whole exchange from the back, and I think there's been a misunderstanding." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I'm your biggest donor." Trump's eyebrows furrowed slightly, his interest piqued. "Biggest donor?" he echoed, still processing the information. The owner nodded, his expression calm but serious. "Yes, I've supported your campaigns for years now. I believe in what you stand for, and I've made significant contributions to help your cause. In fact, I'm a huge supporter." His voice grew quieter as he emphasized the word supporter. It felt almost surreal to Trump, as if the situation had taken a sharp turn into the unexpected. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, time seemed to slow down. The room, which had been filled with the soft hum of conversation, now buzzed with silence. The staff, who had been so adamant about enforcing the restaurant's policy, stood frozen, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The hostess, who had initially insisted that Trump remove his hat, was the first to break the silence. Her eyes widened in shock as she processed the owner's revelation. She glanced quickly at the manager, who stood beside her, equally stunned, both clearly unsure of how to handle the situation now. Trump, too, seemed momentarily taken aback. The initial shock on his face gave way to something deeper, a flicker of introspection. He had been prepared for resistance, for the usual animosity that followed him wherever he went. But this was unexpected. His mind raced for a moment, trying to reconcile the seemingly contradictory situation unfolding before him. "You're saying you've been supporting me all this time?" Trump asked, his voice filled with surprise and curiosity. It wasn't that he doubted the possibility, it just didn't make sense, given the tension in the air. Here he was, standing in the middle of a restaurant where he had been refused service. And yet, the very man who owned the place was one of his most dedicated financial backers. "Yes," the owner replied, his tone steady. "I've always been behind you. What's happening here? It's not personal. It's just a policy. One that we've enforced for a long time, and I thought it was something everyone could agree with. But now that I see the way things are escalating, I realize it was a mistake. I never thought it would come to this." The words of the owner hit Trump like a sudden realization. The puzzle pieces started to fit together in his mind. This wasn't just about the hat. It wasn't about the politics, the symbolism, or the usual divide. It was about the perceptions and judgments that people, particularly those in the service industry, held toward him, and the people who followed him. Trump had often spoken about the power of appearances and how society seemed quick to judge based on surface-level things. But standing here in this high-end restaurant, the reality of that truth was hitting him hard. In the stillness of the moment, Trump glanced back at the other guests. Some looked down, uncomfortable. Others exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to speak up or remain silent. The staff continued to stand frozen, unsure how to proceed. Everyone in the room seemed to be waiting for the next move, the next twist in this strange, unexpected encounter. "I understand," Trump said after a moment, his voice quieter than before. There was a hint of something deeper in his words, something that felt more personal. He wasn't angry, at least, not anymore. He had been prepared for confrontation, for the usual pushback, but this wasn't what he had expected. He felt reflective, as if the situation had opened up a window into something larger. It's not about the hat, is it? It's about the way people are judged based on their beliefs, on what they wear, on the symbols they choose to represent. The owner nodded, his expression softening. "Exactly. I never intended for things to escalate like this. I just wanted to make sure everyone felt comfortable here, but I didn't take into account the deeper implications of the policy. I can see now how unfair it must feel, how it must feel to be judged based on something so superficial." Trump took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had always been on the receiving end of judgment, from both his supporters and his critics. But now, standing in this restaurant, he couldn't help but wonder, how many of his supporters had faced the same kind of rejection, the same kind of judgment, just for standing up for what they believed in? "Maybe it's time to rethink some things," Trump said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. He wasn't sure exactly what that meant yet, but in that moment, he understood that this was more than just a disagreement over a hat. It was about something bigger, about understanding, about respect, and about the assumptions people made based on appearances. The room remained still, the tension slowly dissolving as the owner turned to the staff. "Let's make this right," he said, his voice now calm and resolute. "Mr. Trump is our guest. No more questions, no more judgments. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." And just like that, the mood in the room shifted. The tension in the air had shifted. What had started as a fiery confrontation between Trump and the restaurant's staff was now giving way to a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. The owner, still standing with Trump in the middle of the restaurant, seemed to absorb the weight of the situation more fully with each passing moment. His expression had softened, and the sternness that had initially marked his demeanor had turned into visible embarrassment. It was clear that he hadn't expected things to escalate to this point, not with someone he had supported for so long. After a long, heavy pause, the owner finally spoke, his voice softer now, tinged with regret. "Mr. Trump, I owe you an apology. This wasn't how I intended for this to go. I'm embarrassed by how things escalated, and I recognize that I could have handled it much better. I was too focused on enforcing a policy, and I failed to see the bigger picture." He exhaled deeply before continuing. "I should have known better, especially considering how much I've supported you. To think that something as simple as a hat would cause this much tension. It's ironic, isn't it?" Trump, standing calmly, took a moment to process the words. His face remained neutral, but there was a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. He wasn't the type to easily accept apologies, especially when it came to the public humiliation he'd experienced. But this situation felt different. This wasn't a typical political clash. It wasn't about the policies or the symbols, it was about the human connection, the simple act of showing respect for another person, no matter their political beliefs or appearance. Surprisingly, Trump's response was calm and understanding. He placed a hand on the owner's shoulder, a gesture that was rare for him, but one that conveyed the complexity of the moment. "I appreciate the apology," Trump said, his voice steady but firm. "But I want to make one thing clear. This isn't about the hat. It's not about the politics. It's about respect. Treating people with dignity, no matter what they believe or how they look. That's what matters." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the restaurant. The staff, who had been watching quietly from a distance, remained still, unsure of what would come next. The owner nodded in silence, his eyes softening as he absorbed Trump's words. It was clear that this was more than just an apology for the confusion. It was a wake-up call. The owner had been so caught up in the idea of enforcing a restaurant policy that he had forgotten the core values of respect and understanding. He hadn't fully considered how a simple disagreement could escalate, or how easily assumptions could be made based on someone's appearance. The irony of it all was impossible to ignore. He had supported Trump for years, but in his own establishment, he had failed to show the same courtesy to the man standing in front of him. "I never meant to create this kind of divide," the owner said quietly, almost to himself. "I've always tried to run this place with respect and inclusivity, but I can see now how easily that can slip away when we don't look at the bigger picture. It's not just about the policies we enforce. It's about how we treat each individual who walks through that door." Trump nodded, sensing the sincerity in the owner's words. He could see that the man wasn't just apologizing because he had to. This wasn't about saving face. It was about genuine reflection on what had transpired. The conflict, though jarring, had opened both of their eyes to the importance of empathy, of taking the time to understand each person's perspective before rushing to judgment. And it wasn't just the owner who was feeling the weight of this realization. The staff, who had stood in the background for much of the exchange, began to stir with quiet guilt. One by one, they stepped forward, each of them feeling the uncomfortable sting of their earlier actions. It was the hostess who approached first, her face flushed with a mixture of shame and humility. She had been the one to enforce the no political symbols policy so rigidly, the one who had caused the initial conflict by demanding that Trump remove his hat. But now, she seemed like a different person altogether. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice low but sincere. "Mr. Trump," she began, "I want to apologize for my behavior earlier. I was just doing my job, but I let my personal feelings and the opinions of others cloud my judgment. I didn't consider the bigger picture. I didn't realize how much harm could come from a simple rule, how much harm it could cause by just judging someone based on how they look or what they believe in." She took a breath, her hands wringing together nervously. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Trump looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. There was no trace of anger or frustration on his face. "It's okay," he said softly. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." His words weren't just meant for the hostess, they were meant for everyone in the room. The message was clear. Redemption and understanding were possible, even after the most uncomfortable moments. Next, one of the security guards, who had been silently observing the exchange from the sidelines, stepped forward. He had been the one to stand by the hostess earlier, ready to enforce the rules if necessary. But now, his posture was different. He seemed more reflective, more aware of the gravity of what had transpired. "Mr. Trump," the guard began, his voice hesitant. I didn't realize how serious the situation had gotten. I just thought I was doing my job. But I didn't take into account how my actions were affecting you. I didn't understand the bigger picture at the time. I'm sorry for my part in this." His words were raw and genuine, as though he too had just come to the painful realization that his role in the conflict was much larger than he had initially believed. Trump smiled faintly, acknowledging the guard's apology with a simple nod. "Thank you. It means a lot." His calmness seemed to put the guard at ease, and the tension that had been building in the room began to dissipate. For the first time since the confrontation had started, there was a sense of resolution. The owner, who had been standing quietly beside them, looked at his staff with a mixture of pride and regret. He had been through many challenges in his career, but this moment, this lesson in empathy and understanding, felt different. He realized that the restaurant's reputation, its policies, and its success meant little if they didn't treat every person who walked through their doors with respect and dignity. He had failed in that regard, but it wasn't too late to make things right. The staff, one by one, approached Trump to offer their apologies. Each of them acknowledged their role in the misunderstanding, and each of them expressed genuine remorse. It was clear that they too had learned something profound from this experience. As the apologies were exchanged, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. What had been an emotionally charged, tense situation had turned into one of reflection, growth, and healing. The staff now understood the weight of their actions, and Trump, for his part, had seen firsthand how misunderstandings could arise from something as simple as a political symbol or a piece of clothing. "Let's make this right," the owner finally said, his voice firm but gentle. "Mr. Trump, I hope you'll allow me to make this up to you. You're a valued guest here, and I'd like to show you that." Trump, sensing the sincerity in the owner's words, nodded. "Thank you," he replied. "But let's move forward, together. We all have a lot to learn." And with that, the moment of tension, of anger, of confusion, gave way to a new understanding, a moment of reflection that would stay with each person in the restaurant for a long time to come. The scene that had unfolded at the restaurant was not something anyone would forget easily. It had started with an air of tension and confrontation, but by the end, the situation had turned into a valuable lesson. One not just for the restaurant staff, but for everyone who had witnessed the events. Trump, despite the earlier escalation, left the restaurant with a sense of calm that seemed to surprise even himself. His exit was quiet, dignified, and without the usual bombastic rhetoric that he often carried with him. He didn't make a scene or shout. Instead, he simply walked out of the door with his head held high, the MAGA hat still perched on his head, a symbol of the political battle he'd been fighting for years. As he stepped into the cool evening air, he took a deep breath, his mind still processing the series of events that had unfolded. Inside the restaurant, the silence was palpable. The guests who had been anxiously watching the entire confrontation were now left to reflect on what had just happened. Many of them were still processing the emotional weight of the situation. Some had come to the restaurant that evening expecting a quiet meal, only to find themselves thrust into a political and personal drama that, at first glance, seemed so straightforward. But now, it was clear that there was so much more beneath the surface. The diners who had been initially shocked by the sight of Trump, many of whom had whispered judgmentally amongst themselves, began to shift their perspectives. They had seen the heated exchange, the escalation, the apology, and the final moment of understanding. It wasn't just Trump who had been affected by the experience, it was all of them too. The evening had forced them to confront their own biases, their own assumptions about people based solely on their political views or outward appearance. A few patrons exchanged glances and quietly muttered to each other, acknowledging that they too had made snap judgments in the past, that they had allowed political symbols and clothing to influence how they saw people. They realized now that assumptions, whether based on a hat or a piece of clothing, could lead to misunderstanding and division. Some of them wondered if the same thing had happened to them on a smaller scale. Had they ever been guilty of judging someone based on their appearance or beliefs? Had they, perhaps, seen others through a lens of bias without considering their humanity first? As the door closed behind Trump, the restaurant began to buzz again, but this time the conversation wasn't as loud or divisive. People weren't gossiping about Trump's hat anymore. Instead, they began to talk more quietly, more thoughtfully, some even apologizing to the person sitting next to them for making assumptions about the situation. Later that evening, the owner of the restaurant, who had remained in the back office for some time after the incident, finally gathered his staff together. His face was serious, but also filled with an air of reflection. He had been through a lot that night: embarrassment, confusion, and ultimately, a deep sense of regret. But there was something else too, a renewed sense of purpose and responsibility. He had been humbled, but he also understood the importance of growth and learning from mistakes. When his staff had gathered, he stood before them, taking a moment to compose himself before speaking. "Tonight," he began, his voice firm but filled with emotion, "we experienced something I never imagined would happen here. It wasn't just a matter of enforcing a policy. It was about our responsibility as a business to treat every customer, no matter their political beliefs, with respect. This wasn't just a political issue. This was a human issue. It was a lesson about inclusivity, about empathy, and about understanding that no one should be judged based on how they look or what they believe." He paused and looked at each of them, his gaze lingering on the hostess and security guard, who had played the most pivotal roles in the initial confrontation. "I want to apologize to all of you for not making this clearer earlier. We've always prided ourselves on creating a welcoming environment for everyone, but we let our policies, our assumptions, and our biases cloud that vision tonight." The staff stood in silence, absorbing the weight of their manager's words. The hostess, who had been at the forefront of enforcing the no political symbols rule, seemed especially moved. Her earlier embarrassment had turned into a deep understanding of just how quickly things could escalate when people allowed themselves to make assumptions based on outward appearances. "We've learned an important lesson tonight," the owner continued, his voice steadier now. "And I want you all to take this lesson with you wherever you go, whatever you do. It's easy to judge someone based on their appearance, or their political views, or even their actions in the moment. But that doesn't give us the right to deny them the dignity they deserve as human beings. Every customer who walks through these doors deserves our respect, whether they wear a MAGA hat, a rainbow flag, or a suit and tie." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "I've decided that from now on, we will make sure that no customer, regardless of their political beliefs or appearance, will ever feel like they don't belong here. We're going to work on fostering an environment where every person feels safe, respected, and valued. We are all responsible for making that happen." The staff nodded in agreement, some of them still processing the depth of the conversation. The hostess, who had apologized to Trump earlier, stepped forward. "I understand now," she said quietly, her voice filled with humility. "I let my own discomfort and assumptions take control, and I'm truly sorry for that. I'll do better." The security guard, who had also apologized, added his voice to the conversation. "We all need to be more mindful. It's not just about following rules. It's about following our hearts, understanding where people are coming from, and recognizing that everyone deserves respect." The owner smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I'm proud of all of you for being open to this change. This is how we grow as individuals and as a business. It's not easy to admit when we're wrong, but it's important to do so, and I believe we're all better for it." As the evening wound down, the restaurant resumed its regular rhythm, but there was a newfound sense of understanding among the staff. They were no longer just employees following policies. They were individuals who had learned the value of empathy and the importance of treating every guest with dignity. The incident with Trump, which had initially seemed like nothing more than a political dispute, had blossomed into something much more meaningful. It had revealed the deeper issue of how society often judges people based on their appearance or beliefs, and how quickly misunderstandings could arise from these judgments. But it had also shown the possibility for growth, for change, and for healing. The owner's commitment to inclusivity, his promise to never allow anyone to be judged based on their beliefs or appearance again, was not just a policy change. It was a reflection of a larger cultural shift, one that would ripple out beyond the walls of the restaurant and into the lives of the staff, the guests, and anyone who heard the story. As for Trump, although he left the restaurant that evening with his MAGA hat still firmly in place, He had, in a way, won something far more valuable. A reminder that respect and understanding were always worth fighting for, even in the most unexpected of places. And perhaps, just maybe, the world could be a little more patient with one another, one gesture at a time. The weeks following the incident at the restaurant were transformative for both the business and its staff. The owner, still reflecting on the lessons learned from that night, made sure the message of inclusivity and respect became the core of the restaurant's new ethos. The impact of the event rippled far beyond the walls of the establishment, touching everyone involved and even the larger community. At the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted. No longer was there a cold formality to the interactions between the staff and customers. The hostesses, waiters, and security guards were more conscious of their words and actions, making sure that each customer was treated with the utmost respect, regardless of their attire, political views, or personal beliefs. They now approached every situation with empathy and open-mindedness, remembering the lessons that had been learned during that heated confrontation. The restaurant felt warmer, more welcoming. It was clear that the culture had changed, not just because of the policies in place, but because the staff now truly believed in those policies. Customers who had frequented the restaurant before began to notice the difference. What had once been a place where high-end meals and fine wines were the main draw now also stood as a symbol of an inclusive space where people from all walks of life were treated equally. Regulars returned to find a more relaxed, accepting environment where they were greeted with kindness, not judgment. New guests walked in, curious about the buzz surrounding the restaurant's renewed values, and left with a sense of respect and belonging that made them eager to return. Word of mouth spread quickly, and soon the restaurant became known not just for its excellent food, but for its commitment to treating everyone with dignity and respect. As part of the restaurant's efforts to solidify this shift, the owner worked closely with the community. He hosted regular forums and events where people could come together to discuss difficult topics, share their opinions, and listen to those who held different views. These forums weren't designed to push any agenda, but rather to promote tolerance, open dialogue, and mutual respect. It wasn't always easy. Some conversations were uncomfortable, and at times tensions flared. But through it all, the owner remained committed to ensuring that everyone felt heard and understood. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he also knew that small actions could make a big difference. Meanwhile, for Trump, the incident at the restaurant remained in his mind, lingering in a way that he hadn't anticipated. At first, he had simply seen it as another public confrontation, another example of the polarized environment in which he operated. But as days passed, he found himself reflecting on the experience more deeply. He thought about how quickly people were willing to judge one another based on appearances, how the simple act of wearing a red hat had set off a chain of events that led to a confrontation. The incident had forced him to confront the reality that the world often viewed him through the lens of his politics, his public persona, and his image. Yet in that moment of tension in the restaurant, something had shifted within him too. It wasn't just about the politics or the hat. It was about how quickly people could make assumptions, how little it took to change someone's perspective. Trump also began to think about the importance of empathy in situations like this. He had always been used to being at the center of political storms, but this experience made him consider how others, even those who vehemently disagreed with him, could feel similarly judged or misunderstood. It was a humbling thought, a realization that sometimes it was not the political discourse that mattered most, but how people treated one another in the everyday moments of life. The restaurant incident, while a personal affront at first, had ended up teaching him something about human interaction and understanding. Although the incident didn't change the course of his career or public persona, it was a reminder to him of the complex nature of human relationships. He recognized that it wasn't enough to simply advocate for one's beliefs. One had to be open to listening, understanding, and treating others with respect, no matter how strongly they disagreed. That was the key to moving beyond political divides and toward a more compassionate society. For Trump, the incident didn't just fade into the background of his life. It was a marker, a pivotal moment in a larger journey of reflection. He started to use the experience as a point of reference when engaging with others in more personal settings. The restaurant experience reminded him that true respect transcended political lines, and that in order to foster a healthy, functioning society, people had to meet each other as equals, not adversaries. The ripple effect of that night was felt beyond the confines of the restaurant and Trump's own thoughts. It became a conversation starter. People from different backgrounds and beliefs began to talk more openly about how their actions impacted others. The idea that small gestures, like a polite word or a moment of consideration, could change someone's day and even their life, became central to many discussions. In the end, the incident was a reminder that change often begins in unexpected places. A simple misunderstanding at a restaurant had sparked a series of reflections and realizations that transcended politics and polarized opinions. The owner's decision to promote inclusivity and empathy within his business became a model for others. The staff's newfound awareness of the importance of respect in all their interactions was a tangible sign of change, and the customers who came to the restaurant were reminded of the value of treating everyone with kindness. For the restaurant, the transformation was real, lasting, and significant. For Trump, the incident was one of those rare moments of introspection that led to a subtle but meaningful shift in his perspective. And for everyone involved, it was a valuable lesson. In a world full of division, it only takes a moment of understanding to create a bridge that brings people together. The restaurant, once known for its high-end food, had now become a place where empathy and respect were just as important as the meals on the table. In the end, that night had achieved more than just a resolution to a disagreement. It had fostered change, not just in a restaurant, but in the hearts of all who were involved.